Thank you so much. Thank you for that warm introduction. Thank you to the university and to the James Monroe Museum for having me. You're all a beautiful sight. There just needs to be waiters coming around with drinks, I think. That would complete it. I was just staring at my institution's name, and there's an obvious connection between George and Mary Washington. I'd like to say that I came from a sister institution, but it's more of a mother-son relationship, so that it's not exactly appropriate. But it's great to be here. I also want to recognize all the veterans in the room, family members of veterans. This is Veterans Day Eve. I was an Army reservist, which basically meant I had a front row seat to heroism done by others other than myself. But tonight's talk is really about service, about national service. I think the timing is very, very appropriate. So there's three main things that I want to talk about this evening in the context of the subject of British naval impressment. I'd first like to talk about how naval impressment helped to ensure that the British Empire basically became the most powerful empire in the 18th century, and that would continue into the 19th and 20th century. In part, I think important part, to this practice of naval impressment. Second, I'd like to talk about the impact of the practice on the American colonies. And last, I'd like to look at the influence that it had in the American Revolution and the War of 1812, which Scott Harris mentioned, and the connection that it had, a very important connection that it had to James Monroe. And especially to his diplomatic career, which I think is like so many things related to Monroe, under-recognized, I think, and really underappreciated. So let's get started with just what impressment was, what it involved. Impressment was a distinctly English form of involuntary forced labor. It dated all the way to the Middle Ages, when coastal towns in England and Wales would pledge ships and men to the crown in return for protection. And like so many things that start out in England, it just continued. It just persisted until the practice really exploded in the period that historians call the long 18th century. That's the period from 1688 to 1815. And if you notice, I know there's some students in the room, you'll never hear a professor talk about a short century. Historians always claim more years than a century actually gives. And during that period between 1688 and 1815, Britain was in almost continuous war against its primary rival, France, and oftentimes Spain as well. And during that period, this practice of impressment, of capturing men to serve in the Royal Navy, expanded. It expanded from really a local practice to a global phenomenon, and it took place wherever Royal Navy ships went. And so the work of impressment was carried out by men that are depicted in this image. They belonged to press gangs. They were headed by a naval lieutenant. He's the gentleman in the picture that has the blue coat. Usually someone like that was joined by a group of men. At sea it would be sailors. On land it would be really any local toughs that they could find. And this image depicts Tower Hill in London, and that was really the center of naval impressment in Britain. And if you really squint, you'll see some ship masts there in the background. And so, of course, we don't have actual pictures of press gangs, so we have to depend on cartoons and caricatures like this, but it gets certain things right. You'll see the member of the press gang is holding a long club. Those were called cudgels, and that's what they would use to detain the potential recruit. They wouldn't want to use a sword or a cutlass or a firearm lest they maim one of their prized recruits. And so, as I said, this practice continued, long after I think people saw it as something that was really very savory or something that should still exist. It lasted into the age of Enlightenment, the age of liberty, the 18th century. And so it was constantly had to be defended. And it actually was legal. It was a legal prerogative of the crown to force men into service, but it had important qualifications. One was that men that they captured had to be sailors. They had to use the sea, and sometimes that was used rather liberally, that definition, but that was one of the qualifications. Another was that the Navy had to take British subjects. And you'll see when I talk about the War of 1812, they violated that rule for sure. And the other legal requirement was that it had to take place during times of emergency, which was usually wartime. And that's one reason I call my book The Evil Necessity. They said that it had to take place in times of necessity, which happened to be, as I said, almost all the time in the 1700s. So Argus had a field day with the apparent hypocrisy of this practice. Britain, Americans often forget, was itself very closely associated with liberty in the 18th century. And so this was seen as a paradox by many people. And so there's this print. You'll see it in the title here. This one is called The Liberty of the Subject. And I think the point is that this subject doesn't have very much liberty. It shows the great commotion that would take place in communities whenever a press gang would show up. The whole town is really opposing this gang. Even the neighborhood dog, you can see, is getting in on the action. And if you look really closely, you'll see that the person that's being apprehended, in his coat pocket, he has a pair of scissors. And that suggests that he was probably a tailor, not actually a seaman. And this was a common thing, that people claimed that the press gang overstepped its bounds and claimed any warm body. And one argument that I make is, while this might have happened from time to time, the purpose of the institution, the reason that it existed, was actually to catch legitimate sailors. And so that gives a little bit of background just to the practice of impressment. In terms of the way that I come at it, people had written about it before. Even though this was the subject of my Princeton dissertation, it wasn't as if I discovered this thing, impressment, that I had found it. People had written about it before, and I always tell my students when they begin a project that they should have a good question. They should have a question about whatever they're writing about. And I think the question that had been posed for impressment when I came upon the topic was, how bad was it? And then historians had different answers, different degrees of badness. British naval historians don't really find much wrong at all in the practice, that this was just a way of life for sailors. And usually American historians, American social historians, described it in terms akin to slavery. And so even though I thought that was an important question, I thought it had been addressed. And so I thought the more interesting question was, if impressment was so bad, why was the Royal Navy so good? Why was the British Royal Navy able to control the seas in the 18th century if they had these conscripted sailors on their ships? And I have to give a little spoiler alert. I'm going to give the answer to the question, so if you're going to read the book and you don't want to know the outcome, just cover your ears. But my answer to this question is that impressment was that bad and the Royal Navy was that good. In other words, both things were true. That impressment was a great sacrifice for sailors, but once they got on the British naval ships, they performed quite well. And I think that's an interesting issue to explore, exactly why that was. And as I said before, it's deeply connected to Britain's empire of the 18th century. If you think back across world history, all empires required certain resources. If we think of our own case right now, the United States would probably identify oil as a key resource. And the British Empire of the 18th century also needed natural raw materials. They needed lots of lumber to build these naval ships. So they needed tar and other things. But I would argue that the resource they needed the most was labor. And they turned to the institution of slavery to fulfill the majority of the labor that they needed in their empire. But impressment was a second form, and it was the second most common form of forced labor in the British Empire after slavery. And I want to emphasize it's a distant second. It's not very close, but the numbers are still significant. I estimate that around 250,000 men were impressed in the 18th century. We don't have the exact numbers because the British Navy didn't always distinguish between volunteers and impressed men on naval ships. And there was an admiral in the 1740s, Admiral Philip Cavendish, that had a great comment about this. He said, they're all volunteers once they find that they can't get away. And in the movie version of my book, he's going to say "arr" after that. That's going to be a requirement. But the point is that sailors were a linchpin of what the British called their Empire of Liberty, or their Empire of the Seas of the 18th century. If there were no sailors, there would be no navy. If there was no navy, there would be no empire. It's really that simple. So I'm going to just describe a little bit of, a little bit about the heroes of the book, or the sailors, the impressed sailors, and what they did, because I had a real admiration for them in doing this research. The type of sailors that the British Navy really wanted weren't just the ordinary sailors. They were the best sailors in the Atlantic. These men were known as able seamen. That was their rating in the Navy. They were also referred to as top men. They were called top men because they would climb the mast of the ship, and you really have to squint here. I'm going to give you a close-up in a second. But those little ant-like figures that you might see or might not see, you can trust me, they're climbing the top of the mast, and they controlled the sails on the ships. And they're more than 100 feet in the air, and they're balancing on a yard, and they're almost like trapeze artists up there. This was an inelastic labor supply. Not just anybody could do this kind of work. It took at least 2 years at sea to learn the ropes. That's a nautical term, in order to be able to do this kind of work. And here's a little close-up of the type of work that that top men did. And so sailors have always had a bad reputation, and they had this in the 18th century. They were really marginalized. And I'm just going to read you a quote by Dr. Samuel Johnson, the famous author of the dictionary, and what he said about sailing. He said, "No man will be a sailor who has contrivance enough to get himself into a jail. For being in a ship is being in a jail with the chance of being drowned. A man in jail has more room, better food, and commonly better company." And so there was certain truth in this, that life at sea was hard. It was marked by terrible food, cramped conditions, and needless to say, lots of damp days and nights. But these professional seamen, rose above these challenges and took enormous pride in their work. And that active impressment was, violated their liberties on a lot of levels, but one fundamental level was just their economic liberty. Sailors during wartime could make twice as much on merchant ships than they could in the public naval ships. And that's because during wartime there was scarcity, there was smuggling, and so when they were taken into the Navy, they really lost out on economic opportunity. And so as you saw with the neighborhood dog in London and that commotion, there was always resistance to impressment. This is one of my favorite prints from the period. This is from the Oxford magazine in 1770. And it depicts another scene in which, and in this case, a seaport community, particularly women, women related or married to the sailors, are resisting the press gang. And just to read the dialogue here, the sailor on the left states, "For God's sakes, gentlemen, don't drag me like a thief." A woman, probably his wife, exclaims, "For goodness sake, dear, your honor, set him free. He maintains his father, mother, sister, and wife." And the press gang officer shows little sympathy, just saying, "Let them starve and be damned. The king wants men. Haul them on board, you dogs." And I just said a terrible swear word for the 18th century. Dog is a really bad word, and so I apologize. I was just reading, it was a quote. And as I emphasized or mentioned, the women are really the forefront of this image. And they're an important part of my book because in looking at the costs of impressment, you have to count the family costs. And I term the women of impressed sailors impressment widows because they never knew when their loved ones would come home. And I designated my wife the ultimate impressment widow for tolerating the writing of this book and all the research that it required. So there was always spirited resistance against impressment. There was nonviolent resistance and violent resistance. The nonviolent resistance in some ways is more fun, all the different things that sailors did to evade capture. I found a couple of sailors that hung up a sign outside a building in London and basically set up a fake law practice. Many others swam away to escape the press gang or used various disguises. And here's an example of one of the disguises. And you can probably figure it out from the title of the print, Jack Detected Sailing Under False Colors. There was many sailors who cross-dressed in order to not be captured by the press gang. The sailor in this case, I think, went a little bit overboard. He kind of looks like a mummy there in all his garb. And so if they couldn't get away, using nonviolent resistance, sailors would often resort to violent resistance. This is an image of impressment outside a New York City tavern in the 1760s, and it shows the violence that was always present in capturing sailors. And I'm going to talk about rioting a little bit more in just a second, but first I just want to turn to the second half of my question. I asked if impressment was so bad, why was the British Royal Navy so good? And in the second half, we have to really question, why would these sailors perform well for the Navy if they were being taken away from their families, if they were being taken away from economic opportunities? And one thing I've found, and I didn't expect this, is that for all of its problems, impressment worked, at least for the state, at least for the British Empire. It produced the skilled sailors that were needed for the Navy. And so I looked at this in different contexts, and one thing I found is that once sailors were impressed, they were treated just as well as volunteers. And by that I mean they were promoted at the same rates. They were actually promoted even faster, because usually impressed sailors were better seamen. They're the ones that had the least incentive to volunteer. And so, I think they got some sense of pride in their service eventually. There was definitely a socialization period. The resistance tactic of choice was desertion, just to leave ships. But I found that about 70% of all desertion cases took place in the first year a man was on a ship. And so if they could survive that first year, it was very likely that they would stay for the duration. And the desertion rates in the British Navy were actually much lower than for competing navies, like the French and Spanish. About 7% for the British, usually double that for the French and Spanish. And so they got a sense of pride from their service, and they had a lot of incentive to do well. After all, they're all at sea, and it wasn't as if they could just sabotage the ship, right? They would all sink. They would also face incredible discipline and physical coercion in order to serve. But I still think there's some willingness to do well. The best example of this was African sailors. This is one of the few places in the 18th century where people of African descent could be treated almost equally to whites. And so I found in the case of black sailors, either enslaved, runaway, or free, that impressment was really a step up. And a great example of this is Olaudah Equiano, who wrote the most famous autobiography account of slavery in the 18th century. And in his narrative, he's most happy when he's at sea, either serving on merchant ships or in the British Navy. And he eventually left the Navy in the 1760s, and he famously became free. He served in the Navy, and he received that rating of able seaman. He left the service for 14 years. He came back into the service, and they still recognized his rating, which meant they had to pay him more than they would if he was just some ordinary sailor. So I think that helps to show the certain level of opportunity that was available in the Navy at this time. And so just to summarize up to this point, Britain couldn't have ruled the waves in the 18th century, as the famous song goes, without the influx of quality seamanship that they received from impressed sailors. But there was a catch. In using forced labor to basically create their empire liberty, there was great risks because of the opposition that sailors had to it, the unpopularity of this service. And I'm going to turn now to the American colonies, because it was nowhere was it more unpopular than it was there. The American colonies, the British had a real advantage over their rivals because of impressment. They could always get more men for their ships if they faced the 3 Ds, They always talked about the 3 Ds in the 1700s, death, disease, and desertion. And so ship captains could stop in different ports and just get new men that can continually replenish if they had to. But they had to be very careful when they did this because there was often riots, there was often uprisings. A lot of colonial sailors weren't full-time professional sailors like the ones that sailed out of ports in Britain, especially London. And so they belonged, they were very fixed in their community, so there was a lot of opposition if they were taken away. And the best example of this is an event called the Knowles Riot, named after this gentleman, Admiral Charles Knowles, that took place in 1747. The Knowles Riot was the biggest uprising against British imperial rule between the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the American Revolutionary Riots, the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 and 1766. And he looks like such a nice guy. Charles Knowles came into Boston and, like so many British ship captains, commanders, was short on men because of the 3 Ds. He impressed approximately 50 sailors in Boston, but he made a huge mistake. He took a lot of Massachusetts-born seamen, and there was an unwritten rule that the Royal Navy, they could take men born elsewhere, but they couldn't take men that were from that particular colony. And so the town rose up. There was a riot that lasted for 3 days. The governor at the time, William Shirley, fled. He went to one of the islands in Boston Harbor, and it looked very bad for a while. The crowd had actually kidnapped some of Knowles's officers, a little bit of role reversal that took place. And the riot only ended when Knowles aligned his fleet with the cannons facing the town of Boston. And he said, "By God, I'll now see if the king's government is not as good as a mob." Another quote that deserves an R at the end. And so at that point, the crowd finally gave up Knowles's men, and the crisis went away. Afterwards, there was a large debate about what happened. Pretty much the whole town had rioted, but in official accounts, they blamed the young, the poor, and people of color for the uprising, with one exception. The young Samuel Adams published his own newspaper at the time. It was called the Independent Advertiser. And he defended the crowd action that took place in 1747 on the grounds of basically using Lockean reasoning. The idea that because the government had fled, the people had been reduced to a state of nature. Not only had the government fled, but it was, enacting violence on the people, and that the people had a right, really a duty, to rise up and resist. Well, this was the first time these types of arguments were ever used in the American colonies. And if they sound familiar, they were used again during the American Revolution. At the time, Samuel Adams was just 25. He had just finished his master's work at Harvard, and there's a great match to his educational learning and what he actually ended up doing. His master's project at Harvard focused on when it was legitimate to resist government authority. And that's basically the title of his work. So even though I argued this isn't the beginning of the American Revolution, a lot of these arguments are rehearsed. A lot of the same things took place, and it eventually they were used in the 1760s and the 1770s. Well, I'll close now by turning to the American Revolution and the War of 1812. I think a period that most of us spend probably more time on than the American colonial period. And I have to give a disclaimer. I wouldn't discourage anyone from buying my book, but my book focuses mostly on the 18th century, the period before the War of 1812. And I turned it into my publisher, the University of Virginia Press, and they said, "This is great, but we want you to take this last part, the epilogue, we want you to turn it into another book." And so I'm impressed myself into this subject right now. I'm writing a second book on impressment. It's called Citizens and Subjects. And so you're a perfect test audience for me. I'm going to test out some of the ideas. And I do cover this period at the end of my book, but I'm expanding it right now. That's the work I've been doing at Mount Vernon this fall. And so one reason I didn't cover the book, American Revolution and the War of 1812 in more depth in my first book is that it's so big. And the world literally changes with the American Revolution. I call it citizens and subjects because prior to that period, the American colonists were subjects. They were subjects of the British Crown. And because of that, they were legally impressed into service. As a subject, you owed your life to the Crown. Your entire life. You couldn't leave that obligation. There was a name for that. It was called indefeasible allegiance or perpetual allegiance to the Crown. And so in the American Revolution, you begin to see some arguments against that. And the most radical argument that I found against impressment during the American Revolution was written, probably with not too much surprise, by this gentleman, Benjamin Franklin. Between 1764 and 1775, Franklin was in London as a colonial agent. And so Franklin really becomes American by being in Britain. And I think the incident I'm going to describe is part of that process. In the fall of 1770, the British Navy began impressing men for a possible war with Spain over the Falkland Islands. Some things never change. And so there was a lot of commotion about impressment. And during that period, Franklin was curious, and so he read the most important legal decision basically affirming the legality of impressment. It was written in 1743. And he read this, and in the margins of the decision, he responded. And he gave a counterpoint to each of the judges' points about why impressment should be legal. And Franklin's genius was to concede the legal point. He basically said, okay, this might be legal, but that's the problem. And it reflects a larger problem with the British Constitution, which up to that point had been very popular with the American colonists. And he said of the British Constitution that it's yet imperfect, since in so general a case it doth not secure liberty, but destroys it. And at his most devilish, Franklin offered a solution to the problem of impressment. The only way to make it fair would be to impress judges, like the one that had written this decision, to impress British politicians, and even to impress the king into service. And this is what he wrote. To say the truth, Franklin explained, I'm not quite satisfied of the necessity or utility of that office in Great Britain, as I see many flourishing states in the world governed well and happily without it. So this is in 1770. This is very early for such radical language. John Adams, in his autobiography, said this is the moment at which Franklin really turns against the crown. Unfortunately, his comments were trapped on the margins of this legal decision in a London bookshelf all during the American Revolution. They didn't see the light of day until the 1780s when they were published in a magazine. But it was one of the really neat things I came upon in my research, and this marginalia is now published in the Franklin Papers, and so it's available to scholars. Well, very interestingly, at this exact moment, the fall of 1770, another person in London is asking similar questions about the legality of impressment. And that person was George III. We often think of George as an old man, but he too was once young. And I'd like to say that no animals were harmed in the making of this portrait, but I think they probably were. George hadn't had a major naval mobilization since he had become king in 1760. And so when this started to take place in 1770, he wanted to, learn more about impressment. So he turned to the same legal decision. And one of the things I found in my research in London were his notes on the legal decision. And he was much different in style and substance than Franklin. Whereas Franklin was creative in writing on the margin and coming up with his own solution, George took very dutiful notes, almost word for word, of what was in the decision. The kind of notes that we tell students not to take, right? You need to take thoughtful notes, engage with them in different ways. And this is part of what George wrote. He said, I think the crown, him, hath a right to command the service of mariners whenever the public safety calleth for it. the same right that it hath to require the personal service of every man able to bear arms in case of a sudden invasion or formidable insurrection. This personal service is a principal branch. This personal service is a principal branch of the allegiance every subject owes to the crown. So again, the difference, the emerging difference between citizenship and subjecthood in the British Empire. So, soon Britain and Spain patched up their differences over the Falkland Islands, at least at this moment, and that was done. But this difference between citizens and subjects persisted. Impressment continued to be a problem for the Americans throughout the American Revolutionary War, and then of course in the years leading up to the War of 1812. And a lot of commentators actually identified that this might be a problem, that once the Americans had broken away, that they would look an awful lot like British sailors. They would still sound like them, and the problem would continue. And so this is something that Thomas Jefferson put into the Declaration of Independence. One of the grievances against George is that he has constrained our fellow citizens, taken captive on the high seas, to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. And in that phrase, and in each instance in which Jefferson refers to the American people in the Declaration of Independence, he uses the words, our fellow citizens. You might remember a story that came out of the Library of Congress a couple of years ago. They were using digital imaging equipment to really examine, really do an X-ray of one of Jefferson's drafts of the Declaration of Independence. And they discovered that in one of the lines, Jefferson had slipped up. And instead of saying our fellow citizens, he had written our fellow subjects. And I think this shows that even for a revolutionary like Jefferson, that this idea of subjecthood was very ingrained. He had that little slip up. And you'll see that he did what I think all of us do, or have done at some point when we've made a mistake. He tried to cover it up. He used an eraser. The technology hasn't changed much in 200 years, pretty much the same technology. He tried to erase. He wrote over the word subjects. So he starts at the bottom, and you can see how it proceeds up until subjects become citizens. And he probably thought that he had gotten away with it, except for our fancy technology of the 21st century. And this is a good story to lure students into history, that it's cool, like CSI. This is what we do during the day. So as I said, impressment continues to be a problem. And in 1786, after the American Revolutionary War, one of the people that talked about this was a British lieutenant named John Mackenzie. And he said, if an impress takes place, how are the Americans to be distinguished by officers upon that service? Or rather, how are they to disprove the assertion of any man they are attempting to impress who declares himself to be an American? Anybody could claim to be an American. The familiarity being so great in their figure, complexion, language, manners, and habits as to render it impossible to distinguish the one from the other. And sure enough, that beginning in the French Revolutionary Wars of the 1790s, starting in 1793, and going up to the War of 1812, which really did start in 1812. That's one math problem that historians have gotten right. There's approximately 10,000 American sailor citizens who were impressed, and we're still working on the exact number. There's higher estimates and there's lower estimates, but that's currently the consensus number, that there were 10,000 citizens impressed. And so this was a real crisis for the new United States, a real violation of their sovereignty. And it raised all kinds of questions about what really made a citizen a citizen. Was it by birth? Was it by naturalization? Was it by choice? How did somebody become an American? In 1796, the United States government tried to answer this question. Congress tried to answer the question by passing a law saying that when sailors went to sea, they should carry documents like this as a form of identification and protection. These were called sailor protection certificates. They identified where the sailor was from and any clear features that he might have had. So you can see the eagle there at the top, the symbol of the United States. And this particular sailor's name was Matthias Verena. And this protection was issued by Joseph Wilson, a U.S. Customs collector at Marblehead, Massachusetts in May 1804. It indicates that Verena was 24 years old. He stood 5 foot 6 inches, was of a light complexion, and had a scar on his left knee. And so Congress and the Washington administration, which started this policy, thought that with this kind of paperwork that press gang couldn't take a legitimate American citizen. If someone had gotten Verena's protection, they would have had to make a scar on their knee if they didn't already have one. And I think sailors actually would do that in order to avoid impressment. The problem is that anybody could get these certificates. And as you might imagine, the people that wanted them the most were British sailors. And so there was a cottage industry that formed in making these different protections. And so eventually, British press gangs were instructed to basically ignore them. They did an interrogation of a sailor at the point of capture. And if that person couldn't show enough knowledge about where they were from, or if they were suspicious in any way, if they sounded British, which a lot of Americans still did, they would be impressed. And so in the short term, this led to more sailors for the British Royal Navy. But in the long term, it had the ironic effect of making Americans actually affirm their separate citizenship status. And those impressment widows that I mentioned earlier went to work collecting as much documentation as they could, baptismal records, marriage records, employment records, anything they could. They flooded the US State Department with this information, and the State Department in turn tried to convince the British Royal Navy to release Americans. And I estimate that in about 20% of the cases, the British government actually did. There were times they didn't claim the legal right to take American citizens. They just claimed the legal right to reclaim their subjects and just said that they couldn't tell the difference. But that leaves the other 80% that were stuck in the British Navy. One interesting consequence of this is that the relationship of African American sailors to the British Navy changed. With the onset of gradual emancipation in the northern United States, one of the main jobs that African American men filled was the work of a sailor. And by the early 1800s, about 20% of all sailors in the United States were black. And one thing I found that's interesting in my research is that they would be issued these protection certificates. So in all these other ways, their citizenship wasn't recognized. It was at sea. The problem is, if they were captured, they didn't always have the paperwork. They didn't have all the paper records to submit to prove that they were actually from the United States. And so one sailor I found, a gentleman by the name of Noah Brown, didn't take any chances. Whenever he went to sea, he carried a jug of rum and a bottle of laudanum. And his son said that he did this because he knew the press gang to be dear lovers of the articles, and they would have any if it was found on board. And drinking them freely, they would soon be unable to do anything. So I thought this was a pretty clever resistance tactic. Overall, the protections fail. Obviously, if sailors felt like they had to carry jugs of rum to sea in order to escape. The one thing that might have worked was diplomacy. And this is where James Monroe comes into the story. I mentioned that Monroe's diplomatic record is very underrated. This is somebody who served as the US Minister to France during the French Revolution. He got Thomas Paine released from jail. He got the family of the Marquis de Lafayette released from jail. He went on to engineer the Louisiana Purchase, just doubling the size of the United States. And then in the early 1800s, he served as the US Minister to Britain in the Thomas Jefferson presidency. And during that time, he was instructed to try to negotiate a treaty with Britain over the issue of impressment and other issues related to maritime commerce. And he and his replacement, who had arrived in London, William Pickney, negotiated the treaty None of these treaties have very creative names. The Monroe-Pinckney Treaty, which is essentially the successor to the Jay Treaty of 1794-1795, negotiated by John Jay. The Jay Treaty didn't solve the problem of impressment, obviously. And this is something that Monroe was supposed to do. And he negotiated with the British, and he realized this is one thing they would not give in on. The Americans saw impressment as a violation of their sovereignty. Well, the British saw impressment as an exercise of their sovereignty. So it's an issue of independence for both of them. But Monroe was able to get the only concessions from the British that I know of for this entire period. The British agreed to recognize American territory 5 miles out to sea. There was also a kind of a gentleman's agreement to tell British officers to go easy on American citizens. And so this is basically the best deal that the United States was going to get. Well, Monroe sent it back to Washington, and Jefferson rejected it immediately without even submitting it to the Senate. He called impressment the sine qua non of the instructions, of the diplomatic instructions, the indispensable, the essential component. Monroe had a much more pragmatic approach. He thought, like the Jay Treaty that was negotiated in the 1790s, that this was the best that the Americans could get. He wrote in 1807, "We flatter ourselves that the treaty will meet the approbation of our government and country. It was the best under the existing circumstances it was possible to obtain." And so the party that was opposed the Jeffersonians, the Federalists, were astonished at Jefferson's behavior at rejecting this treaty. The Boston Sentinel, a Federalist newspaper, found it extraordinary that the president should reject the work of envoys whom he himself appointed, and even more extraordinary that he should fail to submit the treaty to the Senate. And I think it's fair to say historians of all different persuasions tend to agree with that newspaper's assessment, that this treaty likely would have bought the time necessary to have the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars ended, and it might have avoided the War of 1812. But of course, we know that that event ultimately happened. Monroe was at the center of the declaration of the War of 1812 as well. By 1811, he had become the Secretary of State in James Madison's administration, and he negotiated constantly with the British minister to Washington, Sir Augustus John Foster, trying to find a solution to the impressment crisis. And again, they ran into this wall. They couldn't solve the problem, and neither man blamed the other about the war happening. Monroe wrote to a friend in England, he said, "I came into the office which I now hold with the best disposition to promote an accommodation of all the differences between the two countries. But under the instructions of your minister here, it has been utterly impossible to succeed." And so the war happened. As for the war itself, the outcome was much different than Americans thought it would be. Americans thought that they would do quite well on land, and their plan was to invade Canada. How else do you fight the British Empire in America? You invade Canada? Well, that failed 3 times and led to the largest surrender of American land in its history, with the surrender of the Michigan Territory in August of 1812. But the United States had surprising success at sea. They won a series of single-ship actions against British frigates. One important reason was that the American ships, like the USS Constitution, were larger than their British counterparts. Britain was still fighting Napoleon in Europe, but I think it has something to do with morale as well. The American sailors were volunteers and wanted to be in this fight. And so the maritime phrase became one of the leading slogans of the war. It was called free trade and sailors' rights. And it ended up on all kinds of different articles during the War of 1812. You can see here an example of it on some scrimshaw, whalebone. It was on flags. It was on pictures. And it gets out a second definition of citizenship that I find very interesting. Rather than that literal definition of what makes an American citizen, it's more of a metaphorical definition, the way that people thought about their citizenship and what it meant. And in this case, people didn't need to be sailors. They could be regular landlubbers, probably like most of us, in order to internalize the experience of impressment. And so in the motto, free trade and sailors' rights, in songs, poems, pamphlets, novels even, newspapers, they all drew attention to the fate of Americans that were impressed into the British Royal Navy. And through these various cultural mediums, the impressment of a small minority of Americans really became the shared experience of the entire nation. And so, you know, the people that weren't at sea were able to imagine sort of this deeper meaning of American citizenship. And the one thing that, the way it was defined is that it was a choice. Whereas British subjecthood was an obligation, to be an American was a choice, and it was a more consensual relationship that involved various responsibilities, of course, but at fundamental, people could either choose to be American or not. Well, that was all well and good, but there was still a war going on. And so while people were waxing philosophical, bad things were happening in the war. And ultimately, as we know, because it happened 200 years ago, just this fall, the British invaded Washington, burned nearly all the public buildings. This is a British version of those events. This is from a London print from someone that obviously wasn't there. And different images of America from Europe at this time, they're always very fanciful. America always has castles and mountains, and this is a good example of that. This is a more recent and less subtle depiction of the burning of the White House. Now, one day after the burning, there was a massive weather event, as we'd call it today. There was some type of a mix of a hurricane or tornado. There was torrential rains that put out most of the fire. And so other than that storm, I think James Monroe is one of the few heroes of this event. He's one of the few people that actually comes out of the invasion of Washington looking pretty good. He had communicated to the Secretary of War at the time, John Armstrong, that this was a real possibility. He had communicated it to President Madison. He thought the British were going to invade, and the other members of the cabinet really thought it was really a feint, and that the main action would continue to be in Canada. So they didn't really have proper defenses for Washington. Well, Monroe evacuated his family quite early, but then he stayed on, and he was the last cabinet minister to be in Washington. And he said that he would rather remain than be an idle onlooker. And so after the burning, he actually took charge and prepared defenses in case the British came back. And the Secretary of War at the time lost his job. It was given to James Monroe. Monroe became the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War at the end of the War of 1812. The one other person that came out of the War of 1812 looking pretty good was Dolly Madison. And like Monroe, she helped in the evacuation of the city, and particularly the White House. She got out important executive papers and the famous portrait of George Washington that was done by Gilbert Stuart. And you'll see in the East Room of the White House, and in fact, if anybody saw President Obama's recent press conference, he was in that room, and that painting is always a nice backdrop. Just by coincidence, James Monroe and Dolly Madison end up at the same farm in Maryland when they fled Washington. And it took several days for James Madison to find Dolly, but I think symbolically it's important that Monroe and Dolly were together, the two people that knew what was going to happen and did the most to actually save the city. Well, the British never came back to Washington. They headed north to Baltimore, where they bombarded Fort McHenry. And of course, that's the scene that provided the inspiration for Francis Scott Key to write the poem, The Star-Spangled Banner, which became our national anthem. And when Key talks about the rocket's red glare, he wasn't kidding. There really were rockets that were happening at that time. So by this point, I think the Madison administration had felt that they had, avoided some bullets, some rockets, and they were pretty lucky that the country was still in shape. And they decided this war over impressment probably wasn't worth it anymore, and so they wisely pursued a peace, the Treaty of Ghent. And Monroe, as I mentioned, was Secretary of State at this point, and the Treaty of Ghent came back to Washington, and it didn't solve any of the problems of the War of 1812. It returned relations to status quo ante bellum, as they were before the war. So it said nothing about impressment. And I find it really interesting that Monroe embraced this treaty, and I have to imagine that he was thinking to himself, this is the deal we could have had 8 years ago when I was in London and negotiated the treaty that I sent President Jefferson. So as it turned out, it was okay that impressment wasn't mentioned, because the practice went away by 1815 with the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And the main reason is that Britain had general peace for the rest of the 19th century. The Pax Britannica of the 19th century meant that they didn't need impressment. And by the time they had wars in the 20th century, they had finally figured out the way to have a full-time naval force. As for the United States, simply surviving the War of 1812, along with Andrew Jackson's huge victory at the Battle of New Orleans in early 1850, convinced Americans that they had actually won the war. And you see that in numerous images, and this is one of the most significant ones that have emerged and that people have been emphasizing in recent years. We owe allegiance to no crown. It's hard to see here, but that's a sailor. The sailor is stomping on the British crown. I think a symbolic action against monarchy and all that it represented, including impressment. And so, I think it's kind of delusional to think that the United States truly won. I think the only people that really won the War of 1812 were the Canadians and Andrew Jackson, and maybe James Monroe and Dolly Madison. But in purely nationalistic terms, it had been very important for the United States. The crisis of impressment had forced Americans to affirm their separate independence from Britain and other European countries, and it forced them to define what it meant to be an American citizen. As former British subjects, Americans really deeply resented being reduced once again to a colonial status. And so once impressment ended in 1815, it had a truly remarkable history. It had been an institution that had humble origins in the Middle Ages. It had become one of the great paradoxes of the Age of Enlightenment. It had helped to prop up the most important empire of its time, the British Empire, and it had helped to give birth to new notions of citizenship and nationalism in a future superpower, the United States. Thank you very much. Yeah, that'd be great, yeah.
Dr. Rhodes will take a few questions here, and there'll be a chance in mingling afterward as well.
Okay. Yeah, any questions?
I'll show my.
All right, there we go.
What, and I don't know what it is, the difference in era or Navy versus Marine. What's the difference between impressment, being impressed, and being Shanghai?
Yeah, great question. So there's many forms of forced service, of abduction, conscription, and one of the most famous ones was used in the Pacific in terms of forcing Chinese seamen and laborers to the United States to work. And that became known as Shanghaiing. And I think the actual physical actions were probably quite similar. The biggest difference was that was a private action, a commercial action in essence, whereas impressment was public and legal. And so impressment has other parallels to other things. The later draft. France had a system of conscription at the time. The big difference was that it was very orderly. France had a record of every sailor in the country, and they would take them, they would Shanghai them, but only for 3 years at a time. And then they were free to go. And the British, people that wanted to get rid of impressment always upheld that as a better alternative. The biggest problem was that it was French. And it was actually rejected because of the bureaucracy involved. That was considered more tyrannical than hitting someone over the head with with a club and putting them in the Navy. So there's important similarities. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Was impressment permanent, or did these then go back all after?
Okay, excellent question, and something I should have covered. Was impressment permanent? You know, sailors often refer to themselves as slaves, that they had been enslaved, but you know, there was really important differences with slavery, and that's one reason that the actual slaves wanted to be impressed, because impressment lasted for the duration of a war. It wasn't permanent, it wasn't hereditary in any way. Some wars could be very long. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars were more than 20 years in total. So you know, someone could be in for a long time, but then they went free. It sounds funny, but the burden at the end of the war is all of a sudden a sailor would become unemployed. and at that point, that's when you see the spike in piracy in the 18th century. A lot of these former Navy seamen out of work, can't find jobs, they turn to piracy. So, great question. All right. Say that one more time. Okay, yeah, excellent question. So the African seafarers that end up in the British Navy, I think that's a very open question and a good question. And what happens to them after a war ends? And I think they were starting to become the sailors for the Atlantic, for these Atlantic voyages and merchantmen, commerce. So I think they would try to get work doing that. It became very common. But like like the white sailors, they would be at least temporarily unemployed, yeah. and at risk of re-enslavement in some cases. Yeah. Yeah.
I believe I understand this correctly that even during the hostilities, there was a lot of communication between the U.S. government and the British government over some of the cases of impressment. And is there some means of sometimes redressing the wrong or getting somebody sprung?
Yeah. So connections helped. If someone had a connection to one of the British ministers, like this gentleman Foster, or some other diplomats that might have been in the country, that always helped. But the pattern that I've found, the only rational explanation of people who are released versus those that aren't, is that in the original law that created those citizenship protections, it was supposed to be government employees, customs officials that issued the protection. That was from the actual US government. As it turned out, anyone who had access to a printing machine, would try to create the certificates, particularly notaries. Notaries loved this. This was great business. There was a black market in them, and they'd make a lot of money. So the British government caught on to this, and they wouldn't release anyone who didn't have one of these protections from an actual customs collector. So that's the one rational thing. The other thing is they do the interrogation at sea, and they would ask all kinds of questions. And today in the British archives, this is one of the exciting things about historical research, there's files of confiscated protection certificates that were considered frauds. And it's really fun to look at these. Some of them, like that Jefferson copy of the Declaration of Independence, you can see that a sailor had tried to erase portions of it and write over, I don't have a scar on my knee, I have a scar on my arm, And then on the back of the protection certificates, the press gang would give their verdict. And so a sailor might claim that he's from Virginia. And so the lieutenant on the press gang would begin to ask him about Virginia and where he was from and go on. And if he didn't answer the questions very well, they would write on the back, and on several of them they'll say, not from Virginia, doesn't know anything about the place, evidently an Irishman, or something, or something like that. Yeah?
After the War of 1812, were there American claims against the British government for financial compensation for the impressment?
Wow, that's an excellent question. Not that I know of. It remains a really important diplomatic issue. We have the benefit of hindsight. Hindsight's 20/20. So we know there wasn't going to be another war, but they didn't know. So the United States is constantly fearful that this will continue, and so it remains, a diplomatic issue into the 1840s, but not claims that I know about, which did exist in the case of slaves, for slavery. Yeah. Yeah. One last question in the back. Yeah. Okay, excellent question. All the students in this room, you guys can come up to GW anytime and, and hang out in my classes. You guys have really good thoughts. They didn't think a lot about the war, to be honest. They were really in an existential struggle against Napoleon. And so the War of 1812 actually wasn't called the War of 1812 until after the Civil War. In America, it was called the previous war, you know, the earlier war. That's what was referred to. And in Britain, it was referred to as the American War. And the one thing that some Britons felt very passionately about, and this might surprise us, was the cause of American Indians. And that was actually, some people that cared a lot about this war in Britain were hoping for some kind of permanent Indian refuge of some sort in North America that might come out of the war. And I think it's fair to say that of all the parties in the war, the American Indians probably lost the most. In losing, and it was kind of the last stand of the Eastern Woodlands Indians against white settlement westward. And so that's an interesting thing that you don't really expect. But in terms of impressment, you know, I said it was always controversial. It was always controversial, but in that war against Napoleon, even people that had been against impressment say, well, we might have to do this until this war is over. So they didn't feel too bad about it in terms of the Americans that were caught up in between. Yeah. Great. All right, well, thank you again. I really appreciate it. Yeah.